Welcome everybody to the Workforce and Business Development Committee meeting. I am Tariq Bokhari. I am the new chair, and we will do introductions now, starting with the co-chair, and we'll go from there. Who's on mute?
It's Malcolm Graham, Vice Chairman.
Renee Johnson, District 4.
Greg Phipps, committee member.
You're muted, Ms. Ajmera.
Dimple Ajmera, committee member.
Great, thank you. I also know that I see a couple other council members and a mayor, perhaps, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
I'm Vi Lyles, and I serve as mayor.
Victoria Watlington, District 3.
And then we'll go to staff, please. Introductions.
Thank you, Councilmember Bokhari. It's Tracy Dodson, City Manager's Office.
Fran West, Economic Development.
Good morning, I'm Christina Thigpen. I'm the new Deputy Director.
Hey, good morning. Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
And then Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, we also have some guest staff leaders from other divisions with us today. Do we want to introduce them now or later?
We can go ahead and introduce who's on the phone or on the call. Do we want to start with Allison?
Allison Craig, Planning, Design, and Development.
Pam?
Is Pam Weidman with us? There she is.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Pamela Weidman, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
John?
Mr. Lewis?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. John Lewis, Executive Director of Charlotte Area Transit System.
Danielle?
Excellent. And then I think we have one external guest, but a very important one as well. Ms. Frazier?
Good afternoon, Chairman Bokhari, and to other council members and staff. Danielle Frazier, President and CEO of Charlotte Works.
And I see Mr. Winston has joined us.
Hello, everybody. Council Member Braxton Winston, serving at large.
And Councilmember Bokhari, we also...
Excellent. So let's get started. I'm going to just tee this briefly up, then I'm going to hand it over to staff. But one of the keys for today is about maximizing our time. We're gonna have as brief possible staff presentations that lay out some very big, some very important topics. And what we want to do is spend most of our time brainstorming what will ultimately, hopefully, lead towards some policy indications, some policy directions for us to consider as we think about this very large topic of workforce and business development and how important it is in our city, not just under normal times, but particularly post-COVID recovery as we're looking at. So our agenda is simple, but it's also very powerful. That first part is going to be critical, the strategic employment plan. We've talked about it at a very high level. We're going to get a little more details on it. But I think, in my mind, most importantly, we're going to spend our time dialoguing today with some other critical touch points. Again, these things don't operate and exist in vertical silos. They're all the way woven throughout everything we do in our city. So we've got our execs and from staff on, from planning, design, and development, and we're going to be able to see jobs, workforce. How do they connect to how we're looking at the 2040 comp plan, how we're looking at zoning as a city. We're also going to do the same thing with housing and neighborhood services, affordable housing. Where are jobs contemplated in those plans? And where are those plans contemplated in our strategic employment plan? Because obviously, these are all tools towards an ultimate objective of upward mobility. Same with Mr. Lewis and Katz. When we look at bus service time to ultimate destinations, how does that touch base to our workforce programs and the jobs we're attracting and the jobs we have? And then finally, with Ms. Frazier and Charlotte Works, that is the hub of where our workforce programming exists. So how are we connecting into those plans and vice versa? We'll talk briefly about the corridors of opportunity, but really importantly, the data we have access to with that EY study, which is going to be fundamental in us creating not a net of workforce and business solutions that we throw over the city, but a scalpel that we're able to go in and find very specific solutions for. And then finally, there's a new section at the bottom. Some days meetings, we may not use it. Some may just be a moment, but it's our opportunity as a council to think of items that have bubbled up to a level of which we can ask staff, hey, this is what we're thinking. Are you thinking the same way? Can you take it away? Doesn't bog staff down, but enables us to get to a point. As the chair, I'm going to go around and meet with everybody on council on a periodic basis and get those items. And I have one item to just mention briefly today in discussing with Renee and a few others that might have some legs, and I think it'd be a good time for us to use it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ms. Dodson, and allow you to take it away.
Thanks, Councilmember Bakari. I think you did a great intro for me. A lot of my work is done. I'm going to kick it to Fran to give remind everybody of the quick overview of the strategic employment plan. If you remember, we presented in January at the summit kind of what this concept was. We just want to remind you of that before we start the dialogue between Danielle and Pam and Allison and John to really talk about how this integrates into other work. So Fran, I'll kick it to you.
Thanks, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. Excited to be back with you today. So Wendy, if you could go to the next slide, please. Just want to do a quick run through, a reminder of the strategic employment plan. So this plan is really to allow our city and our community to create a shared vision for success, and that's economic prosperity for both our residents and our business community. And then coming out of that vision is really this process and this framework for how we all participate in achieving these goals, whether that's opportunities for job growth, upward mobility, for how we all come together and show up in the same lane, advancing the same goals. So next slide. So what's a strategic employment plan? One of the big things that I want to make a point of today is the strategic employment plan is not a workforce development plan. A strategic employment plan has a workforce development community or component, but it's really spanning the whole spectrum of talent in our community. So starting in with our youth in our high schools and our middle schools, to those people in our community who are going to move on through higher education, whether that's at Central Piedmont, UNC Charlotte, to those who are in the workforce community today, to working with our unemployed, our underemployed, our citizens who are seeking a second chance opportunity. And so it's really the full spectrum of talent, as well as really marrying the business community into that. So as you know, I lead the business recruitment and retention team for our department. And so it's really how do we create jobs that align with the strategic goals of our city, of our community, of the talent that's here, whether that's through, we've all done so much work in small business this year, right? So how do we engage our small business community, our middle or our medium-sized businesses, all the way up through our large ones? So we really maximize that effectiveness and make sure that all the hard work that we do every day is putting people to work. Next slide. So why do we need this plan? I think we're going to hear a lot of that today. I think that there's a lot of work going on in our city right now that's very complementary to a strategic employment plan. But we would use this framework to really guide how the city's investing money today, how we're going to, as you'll hear later about our corridors of opportunity, how we're going to help the unemployed and the underemployed, how we're going to grow key sectors and advance our city for knowing that we have the jobs of the future, and most importantly, the workforce who's ready for that future work. Support our talent acquisition efforts of our companies, upskilling, equity goals, and future-proofing our city. I think these are some really big visions that there's a lot of expertise and a lot of great work happening in our city today. And it's a way to bring that all under one framework to show up in a way that makes sense. So next slide. Y'all seen this slide since last October, and I'm very passionate about it. So key question. So while this is a big community initiative, it's also a really city initiative as well. And this is really going to help guide and shape the work that we do in the Economic Development Department. So really identifying what are those jobs that are needed in our community for everyone to have opportunity. What businesses should we recruit? And the talent initiatives. We're going to talk to Allison today around land use and zoning, and John Lewis about, the transit system. And so how do we continue to show up? But I think just as a city alone, this plan is going to inform so many of the things that we do, because we always talk about making sure our residents have good jobs, but we don't ever really define the job piece. And so I'm very excited about this opportunity to do this collaboratively, both with our city and in our city partners, but also in our community. So today we went through the list of people who were joining us, and I want to quickly introduce Danielle Frazier from Charlotte Works. Danielle has been such a great partner and mentor for me personally as we have gone through this process to really understand our workforce development system. I did throw this slide up there really quickly, I think you all know who Charlotte Works is, but just to reorient everyone on their role. But Danielle, I thank you for being here today. Excited to speak with you as we transition into this first question. Wendy, if you could go to the next slide. Really talking about our city's ecosystem. And again, we say employment ecosystem, and I think that's a really important word. This has a workforce development component, but it's not a new workforce development plan. And so today I just wanted to briefly open up some questions, and we don't have to follow these, Councilmember Bakari, but some questions that we could consider as we start to think about how this strategic employment plan integrates with our partners like Charlotte Works. And so, Danielle, if you just want to give a little context around how you kind of see these two programs working together, I think that would be a great way to start off this conversation.
Sure. Happy to. Appreciate the intro, Fran. So I'll just kind of give a quick overview too, just of our strategic plan and what we're really focused on. It's really focused on aligning the ecosystem between the workforce providers council, and I know many of you are familiar with that group, but it's the large educational workforce serving entities like Central Piedmont, Goodwill Industries, CMS, and others, and how we really align. We understand that there are some gaps. There are some gaps in how we provide services, making sure that we're more aligned in how we're providing services to job seekers and to businesses and meeting the needs. We know that there were needs prior to COVID, but with COVID, those needs have just been exacerbated around housing, around food insecurity, around transportation and others. And so our goal is to really put in the work to make sure that there's a no wrong door approach for our job seekers and for our businesses. And when we think about, where we feel the best alignment is with this particular plan is really around that alignment and a closer connection to those systems that create the transportation, the housing, and the infrastructure that the city is really investing in, and how that ties into jobs. All of that on both sides. It's impacting how we invest in transportation, all these things in these areas. They're impacting job seekers, but then also how can they be job creators? And so I think that's where we see the biggest alignment. At the end of the day, we all want economic prosperity for all. And I think that if we're not trying to achieve that ultimate goal, we just don't succeed as a city, a county, and a region. And I think that that's what an important plan is through a strategic employment plan does.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a really great explanation. And I think too, like as we continue to look towards how the city will play a role, in that connection piece between the companies as well as the talent that we need. We work really hard, but if we're not able to connect it into our residents, I think that we're missing some of the mark. And so I think that there's an opportunity to strengthen our, I look at this too somewhat as process and how we transition projects and with some intentionality between different organizations to making sure that everyone has the opportunity to help participate in these programs. I think
Fran and Tracy, is this a good section to pause for a minute and allow anyone to have a quick Charlotte Works specific conversation, or would you prefer we wait?
So you took the words right out of my mouth, Councilmember Bakari. I think it's a good time to kind of pause. ask if there's specific questions for Charlotte Works, but then also have a little bit of a dialogue about those kind of external partnerships, right? How are we working with some of our external partners before we shift to that more internal discussion?
Great. So yeah, anyone who has a question, pop your hand up. I'll start, Danielle, and I'll ask you this question, which is, we have a very bold direction that we want to point this entire strategic employment plan. I think Fran made a good point of this isn't a workforce plan, right? That is what we have partners, and it's a critical part, but a part that we don't want to duplicate or forget about. In the coming presentation on the corridors, we're going to see some of the EY data. I know you've seen a lot of this before. To me, the power is going to be in the data of, as we look at this geographic plan that makes up our city, particularly in the corridors, where are we going to customize workforce training opportunities based on what the skill set that's there? And then how is Fran and Tracy going to go out and recruit new companies that meet certain of those criteria and bring them right into those spots? Based on what you're doing and where our touch point needs to be with you, how do you feel like the access to data is that you currently have, that we have, and what do we need to do to take the training to the next level with the scalpel of really going in and achieving specific outcomes in specific geographic areas?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think that the EY work has been kind of one of the missing pieces for us, is really understanding. We know the data of the people that we're serving, right? But not knowing where are the skill sets in the community, specifically geographically, where are individuals located? What are some of the major challenges and barriers to them obtaining and retaining employment? So that information is going to be extremely helpful for us, again, as we're working the alignment piece on our end. We've done some strategic efforts as well when the Leading on Opportunity Task Force report came out, where there was high unemployment rates, high poverty in some of these zip codes, and a lot of them, of course, were in the opportunity corridors, if not all of them. I think it's about really being intentional and looking at where our existing programs are. So that's another thing that we're doing through our alignment with our workforce partners, and is understanding the services and the trainings that everyone is providing. Where are they providing those services? We have to take a critical look at our system and say, where is there a need? Where is there a gap? And where can we either shift or pivot? And where can we invest more, whether it's financial support or leverage what's existing, and be extremely intentional about where those programs and services are located?
Totally. And I think that will give us all a really good lens to put on the EY study, because it's these studies collect dust on a shelf normally, right? But we can get very tactical. And Danielle, with your organization as our kind of key partner there, whether we're looking at all of a sudden there's healthcare support expertise that exists on Beatty's Ford, or material moving on Wilkinson, right? Like, these are the kind of things where we can say, okay, well, what's the next healthcare upskill training that takes what they already know and builds on it? Or what's logistics over top of transportation expertise that's there? That's the way we've got to start thinking about this, again, on that scalpel approach. Does anyone else have questions or comments? Okay.
Let's go ahead and continue to ask the questions you want to still work through.
No, of course. I think one of the questions I have too.
Unmute.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate that. I think one of the questions too, Danielle, while we have you here, is kind of what some thoughts around the city's long-term role for this work, and as well as how do you think it would be effective, like, to bring in the business community into this, and what that engagement could look like, just based on your experience here in Charlotte?
Yeah, and I will say where we certainly need some more assistance is really expansion of access to businesses that have talent and workforce development needs. My team and even our ecosystem, we're sometimes small but mighty, and we also have all of our individual approaches with working with businesses and addressing needs and trying to present talent. But we could certainly use the city's assistance long-term and forever to help connect us to businesses and expand our access, especially to small and mid-sized businesses. Helping us to increase access, again, to the job creation and existing jobs, to increasing sustainable employment opportunities. This is part of the challenge that we have, and I'm sure many of you, if not all, are familiar with the Benefits Cliff work that's happening in our community of how we continue to support those individuals as their wages increase, helping to support them holistically until they get to that sustainable wage. I think also helping us to increase our talent sourcing partnerships, where we source our talent, who we're partnering with. Again, we have our partners existing, but there's so many different organizations, whether they're faith-based organizations or grassroots that are out here developing talent, getting the help from the city through neighborhood development and other entities and departments can help us connect better to grassroots efforts to help with talent development. As well as, I have to say, advocating and educating businesses on our untapped talent. We had this issue pre-COVID, but even it's been exacerbated again because of, the challenges. And we have a lot of untapped talent, whether it's individuals with disabilities, whether it's individuals that have been justice involved. We need some assistance in making sure that there's an education component there with our businesses to say, you've got this viable talent and we're helping to prepare it, but we need that opportunity and that connection.
Danielle, I think that's a great response. And I think that is something that the city could most definitely play a role in bringing in the business community, especially, just looking at our team alone with the work that Holly's done in the small and mid-sized businesses to our team on the business recruitment and retention. I do think that there is a broader vision. And I think part of the strategic employment plan, as you know, we call it a framework, and it truly is a framework. It's a framework and a process for which we ensure that our partners are brought into the room and at the table to help contribute.
Yeah.
Real quick question from Councilwoman Watlington, who has been engaged on this at a quite a micro level and finding some great opportunities. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
And really, I've got kind of a high level question at this stage, just as I orient myself. When I think about what is the city's long-term role in the work, what are the metrics? Let me ask you that way. Do we have a sense of, and Fran, if I'm getting ahead of you, let me know, but help me understand what metrics we're trying to impact as we figure out what our long-term role might be.
Yeah, I finally found the camera that's looking at me, guys. So sorry, I've been looking off to the side. I do think that we're going to have to develop metrics. I don't know exactly what they're going to be yet, because I do want to generate them collaboratively with our partners. But it could be as simple as, residents placed in jobs, or, one that we're working on really heavily right now is around unemployment. Well, that's a really easy metric to kind of track. But I think we're going to have to find those that are trackable, which is not always easy. You'll hear in the EY work, we've gotten down to census level data. But as Emily Cantrell always reminds me, incremental change is a good thing. And where I am always like, I want to see instant change tomorrow, that setting those incremental goals, as long as those long-term goals, are going to really be critical for the success. But what those are specifically, we're just going to have to continue to work with all of our partners to make sure they're things that we can attain.
Breakthrough results kind of person too, so I get it. So just as a follow-up, am I thinking about this right in terms of the process? So my thought is, we get an understanding of the landscape. We see what like you said, the unemployment numbers, some of the other metrics that may float to the top. And then based on where we set our targets, we find our place.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. I also think one of the reasons for this plan, again, there's a lot of great work in our community, but like the CELC has metrics around youth. I know the county is working with Charlotte Works on underemployed, and I think if we show up in unemployed based on the data and based on the availability and how we want to invest to create those opportunities, then maybe we create additional metrics around how many people go through the process that were unemployed and now employed, or looking at certain percentages in different census tracts in our city. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. And it kind of gives me a little bit of direction as I think about where we focus our priorities, subject to the execution this work. Sounds like you said the unemployment, and I know we've talked several times about underemployment and career pathing for folks. So that helps ground me to where we play.
And I think that's a critical question, because ultimately you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So at the end of the day, and I think the other thing is we have to live what that opening mantra was, which is not duplicate the work of others that do the work, right? So Danielle's out there doing this work. We don't need to create the same metrics and look at them that she looks at every day. We need to be stakeholders in looking at that and helping it. But I think our measures are ultimate macro outcomes, right? It's not like, did we put affordable housing in the area that was cheapest? It's what was the upward mobility count and how do we maximize the number of units there? It isn't, did we set up the bus system with trips to where people kind of want to go today? It's where we need them to go tomorrow to be effective. So I think it's that futurist kind of look that is our stakeholder data. It's not going to be easy. And that's why we have all these great members of other committees here. And I'm going to go over to Councilwoman Johnson, who I think had a question as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm excited by this approach, this comprehensive approach, and hearing words like intentional and tactical, and really looking at these barriers and how to provide solutions. I do want to ask, we did a study, this committee, worked with the city, and the city provided some data based on zip codes of the barriers in employment. And I believe Danielle was part of that meeting. Can we get some history on that and how that intersects with what we're doing now? It might give some history to Councilmember Watlington and the mayor and Councilmember Phipps, who was not involved in that. We've already done some of this work, right?
So, Councilmember Johnson, that's actually what we're going to talk about in the second section with the Corridors of Opportunity Employment Study. That we've been building on that data that we got from the fall about the zip codes that really looked at the corridors, looked at the barriers. And so that's actually going to be the next section that we get to.
Good question and point. And then I think, Mr. Phipps, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. You hear sometimes, you read in the paper, you hear on the radio or news that companies express frustration that they cannot get the skill set to fill the kind of jobs that they have available. Have we ever done an inventory of what kind of jobs are out there that companies need to be filled, so we can put an action plan around them to see how we can meet some of these job expectations? Is that in the works, or what's the status of that effort?
Councilmember Phipps, that's a great question. I'm going to let Danielle chime in here in a minute, but I will also tell you that our team does that. So while we are business recruitment, we are also business retention. And so working with existing companies that are here today to make sure that they have the talent they need to be successful is really important to us. And so Emily and Alyssa from our team often works with companies who are existing, and our counterpart at the county, Gretchen, to see if they have any challenges or how we can be of assistance. And so we often connect them in with Charlotte Works, with Goodwill, Central Piedmont, UNC Charlotte. Talent runs a spectrum. It's not always companies who can't find entry-level talent. We just did a study on tech talent to help bring in experienced tech talent as we grow as a tech city. But Danielle, can you speak a little bit to how your team looks at hiring needs of existing employers?
Yeah, absolutely. We are. I have a full-time person on staff that is centered around data and research. So we are constantly looking at where jobs in demand are, where they are now, where they are in the future. We have about 7 key industries in demand, and based on those industries and where the jobs are, we try to create workforce initiatives or efforts. So we have some great partnerships with Novant Health, with Atrium Health, and with other companies within these sectors. We probably could do better to expand that, but again, small but mighty team. And so there's all these efforts, even with the Workforce Providers Council, like Fran said, with Central Piedmont, with Goodwill. We're all trying to tackle these jobs and preparing the talent by providing education and training opportunities to give them the best qualified talent. But I think this is an area that always can use opportunity. I know Councilmember Bakari, you have your effort with WIN. There's a lot of different programs that are happening with CLC as well. I think, but there's an opportunity here, and I'll kind of go back to that question of the city's role that just kind of came to me as we're talking, is that maybe there is an opportunity, and we're talking about metrics and things of how maybe the city has a role of pulling, these efforts together and then advocating for data sharing. That's a lot of times when we're talking about metrics, I'm big on baselining, right? What's out there already, who's measuring what, but there's not this consolidated or clearinghouse where we can see the big picture and the big dashboard for our community. And so maybe there's an opportunity here for the city to play a role in that regard. But to your point, Councilmember, there are a lot of efforts happening, but I think that there's a lot of great opportunity. And again, it goes back to us having access to the businesses, because we create talent based on the business needs. And I think the more opportunities and increased partnerships we have, I think the more collaboration can happen.
That is very helpful. As this being our first new kind of committee meeting, clearly any one of these topics, we could have done a whole week seminar on them. So hopefully that's enough of an appetizer right there on that workforce development, talent discussion, that everyone's excited on where we could go, but we're clearly not going to cover all those possibilities in one meeting. So Danielle, we really appreciate you being here for that. I think it's the right time now to shift gears into our inward look as well. So if you look back to what we talked about a minute ago, those data points of, all right, at its most basic level, we've got what talent do we already have in our city that needs a job? Then we've got what talent do we have that can be upskilled, retrofitted to do a job? Then we look at what jobs are out there, to Mr. Phipps' question, but that need to be filled, and we just need to connect the dots, all the way finally to what jobs can we go get and bring there that fit those things. And those four elements become really the foundational piece of how jobs and talent intersect. But then there's this whole other piece, which is the wraparound services, the support, everything you need in that transition to make it possible. So now I think as we look on this inward look, and Fran and Tracy, I'll hand it to you to kind of how you want to go, given that we don't have much time, clearly with Pam and housing, with CATS, with planning and design, all these things are fundamental to, hey, where are folks going to live? How are they going to get there? And the job is the glue that helps us weave that together. So that'll be an important discussion.
Yeah, thanks for that transition. So I'm really thankful, so Wendy, next slide, to have our team of experts here today. They're all great partners in this work. So with Allison, Pam, John, and then Tracy in a different light as focused on corridors, these are all really big initiatives in our city. So I'm excited to have this next conversation. So Allison, I want to start with you. Really, the question for everyone on this during this committee today is for us to really talk about how a strategic employment plan intersects with these huge initiatives in our city that, to your point, Councilmember Bakari, are these wraparound services. So, Allison, we work often together on the comp plan, but also, on land use and zoning. So can you talk to us a little bit today about how you really think about jobs and the strategic employment plan contributing to that?
Fran, for having me. Fran and I, as well as Tracy and I, have had many conversations about this. I think a strategic employment plan is really timely with where we are in the comprehensive plan. Goal 8 of 10 talks about a diverse and resilient economic opportunity. That all Charlotteans will have opportunity for upward economic mobility through access to a diverse mix of jobs. And some of the objectives include increasing the number of workers employed in target industries. But we really could use some additional color on what are those target industries after we move into place type mapping, which will occur after the comprehensive plan adoption. We'll really start laying out those 10 different place types throughout our community, and it would be really helpful to understand what types of jobs we are looking for, because a retail job or a manufacturing logistics job or a commercial office job, those are all in different places in our community and could be in different place types. And so having a deeper dive into what Charlotte wants in terms of their job mix and their workforce development will be really helpful in planning efforts as we move forward through plan adoption, through place type mapping, and then ultimately into mapping the zoning districts. So I think this is a really timely effort, and I appreciate the other council members' points about talking about being strategic. I think it is really important to be strategic about what Charlotte needs, what our community needs in terms of access to career, and what type of businesses we want to bring into our community. So there's certainly a very clear connection here between what those types of jobs are, who those people are, where they want to live, and where those businesses will occur throughout our community. So I think this is a really important time to be doing a study like this.
Allison, I just want to comment on one thing that I hope everyone, it was a small point you said, but I think it was so important. And I hope that's the spirit that we approach all of this stuff in, which is saying, hey, we've got a kind of a placeholder for that, but we've got a lot of work to do. We don't have it figured out, all of these touch points yet. And I think that's the crux of how we're going to get there is we all say, you know what? We haven't overly contemplated the touch point between workforce and jobs into this other thing here. And Councilman Winston, I might ask you as one example here. You've been spending a lot of time specifically looking at the arts, the entertainment industry. And I've heard you multiple times say, artists, the people that need to live. And again, that ties back to the comp plan and all of these things. Like, what's the punchline on, because I think my broader punchline is every single topic, every single industry, workforce, whatever, it's probably got their own nuanced needs. Like, what's the punchline that you've been learning on that entertainment world is how planning intersects that?
Well, yeah, there's a lot, not just the work that I've been doing recently. I work in this industry for the past 15 years that I've been here in Charlotte. And it's been part of my life even before I was an adult in the workforce. But, I think what we're talking about here is sort of like the military aspect. Like this is the metaphor that I use, right? Like wherever there's a job in the civilian world, there's a job in the military world, and those things are transferable, right? So the same thing with arts and culture. All of the issues that we speak of from our priority standpoint, the issues exist in this world around arts and culture. What's the number one thing? Affordable housing and affordable workspaces. They're just like every other industry, but there are kind of there is the intangible part about the creation of cultural centers and creation of cultural capital and the creation of cultural classes. We have not really approached it from a place of embedding this in those three things: cultural capital, cultural class, within our neighborhood development. So if we think about it in a different way, if we think about it not just from an economic development perspective, not in just the ways we've been doing it, but if we do think about it from a housing, a zoning, a planning perspective, if we can create situations and infrastructure and environment where the arts and culture can thrive in community, well, those are small businesses, right? But those are also more beautiful communities, right? Those are there's public art. There are revenues being generated, but more importantly, there's places where culture gets refined. That creates a healthier environment. More ideas being shared. And honestly, products being swapped. So I think these are some of the conversations that I've been having with Tracy, with Taiwo, of how do we kind of horizontally integrate this, where we have been thinking about investments in this really in a siloed way over the past generations.
Yep, that's well said, and I think it just shows the depth of what we're talking about. In the old world, area plans were only viewed as, all right, this is this subset of neighborhoods as part of a broader plan. Now, area plans in the future might be thinking about, geographically speaking, the skills that an arts or entertainment community section of our community exists and what their particular zoning land use and affordable housing needs are. So I think that's a great example. Does anyone else have any points they want to jump in now before we move forward? Great. So Allison, obviously this is just kind of the tee up of where we go from here, but I think it's all about us taking it very seriously that we need to infuse jobs and workforce into horizontally into every other plan that we've kind of historically looked at as its own thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to John Lewis. I think John, really today thinking about Charlotte Moves, but also, I think we could focus on the jobs of today and how we're serving them with the Blue Line and our transit system, our bus system. But I also think that as we contemplate new investment like the Silver Line, how do we think about job creators at those stops? And how do we think about how the Silver Line will be adjacent and could feed into industrial job types as well? And so we'd love to hear a little bit from you, from your perspective on how we could work together on the future of our transit system as well as create new jobs.
Thank you, Fran. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these subjects with the community and with the committee today. I think, this really comes from a transit perspective. We have to look at this from two separate angles. Number one, what can we do from a planning and development perspective? And I'm talking about the Transit System 2030 plan to support economic development. When we look back at the experience from the Blue Line extension, and to a smaller extent, phase one of Gold Line, we've started to see that they've been generators of economic interest. And so because of the investment that we've made in these corridors, these become locations for employment centers. And so from that aspect, the investment that we're putting in from a rail perspective is more than just moving people from point A to point B, but also helps to create community where talent wants to live and where corporations and businesses, small and large, want to locate. So it helps to support that aspect. But when we're looking at the overall, a much broader perspective, taking that back from that strategic standpoint to a more tactical, how do we then begin to utilize our transportation system to weave together all of these plans? Then we become connectors. And so with all the work that our colleagues are doing on the affordable housing standpoint, as we are also doing work in supporting employment, training, how do we get people to training opportunities, whether that's at universities or at our community colleges or at other workforce training centers? How do we create a system that provides access to those opportunities? And that's broader than just our rail conversations. This is how do we create a bus network that provides frequent, reliable service throughout our entire community? Number one. And two, what opportunities do we have utilizing new technologies into the future to continue to meet the needs of the future? And so I've talked about rail. We all know that bus can play a large role in that. But as we start looking at different work centers and different jobs, as an example, the Arts and Culture Center, that's not typically a 9-to-5 work day. And so how do we help support different job opportunities that may be late night, weekends, and into the weekend? And how do we do that with very flexible mobility options? And so I think we have begun to understand the opportunities that the future are going to provide. What we have to do is become very flexible in looking at different ways of providing mobility options to our community, recognizing and supporting all of the planning efforts, the housing and employment training opportunities that we've been talking about this morning.
That's well said. Good examples. And I'll tell you, I think it puts a bow on how difficult this mission is that we're on. It's hard enough in a city our size to just design a bus system, right, or a transit system that load balances where people need to go today from point A to B. Let alone when you overlay that with everything else we're talking about. Where's the place C that they need to go in the future? And we recruit the jobs and the workforce to get there. And so all of this is very much an interwoven strategy that you have to think of the big things, like what is point C, all the way to the small things, like who's at point C, to the arts points, and what time do they travel, and what is conducive to the world that they need, so that we've built, and Fran and Tracy have a tool as they go out and recruit these companies to say, put it here, because this whole community's been designed for what you do. So I think that's really powerful. Who has questions here before we move on? Okay, well, thank you for that. And then staff, back to you.
Yeah, and so thanks, John. I just want to acknowledge the flexible comment. Katz has always been a great partner, so thank you for that. And I want to pass it over to Pam Weidman with our housing department, who you all know. I think that as we constantly talk about affordable housing, and Pam's team has done such a great job thinking about where that should go, want to learn a little bit more about how this plan can work with that to make sure that our residents have access to jobs.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by thanking you all for the invitation to talk about what this kind of, in my mind, cross-sector and cross-departmental collaboration could look like. And so I'm very excited about this conversation and about the opportunity. And Tracy and Fran, thanks for your great work and for bringing this to the forefront. When I think about housing, I think about housing as infrastructure, right? As basic infrastructure, particularly affordable housing is basic infrastructure. And when I also think about affordable housing, I think about kind of the work that the City Council has done so diligently in approving Housing Trust Fund dollars to support this, as just a reminder that we're approving dollars for working families, many low to moderate income working families. And so when I think about the housing plan, just as a reminder that the City Council approved, I believe it was in 2018, that plan is built on 3 pillars, right? And so it's about constructing new affordable housing, it's preserving existing affordable housing, and it's about creating family self-sufficiency, right? And I think the family self-sufficiency portion really lends itself to today's conversation. And when we think about family self-sufficiency, I think about it in terms of helping people, low to moderate income families, obtain affordable housing and also sustain that affordable housing. And when I think about the sustaining, to me, that directly lends itself to this conversation of this whole strategic jobs plan and how do we align the work. So I'll talk about kind of our current practices and how we try to do that. And Mr. Bakari, you're absolutely right. We haven't gotten it exactly right yet. I'll talk about kind of our current practices, about how we try to attack that. And then I'll talk about what I believe to be the opportunities to help us move forward. And so our current practices, when we took a look at the locational guidelines a couple of years ago, and those are really about making sure that our locational guidelines really speak to the amount of investment that that the city is putting to help these affordable housing developments come to fruition. And one of the things we said in terms of our scoring tool, and one of the things we look at when we're bringing these developments forward for council's consideration, is really we have a metric on there that looks at where the job centers are currently, where the proposed developments are going to be located. So we really do look at that. I think an opportunity and perhaps an area for us to align with this work is so there we know that when an affordable development is approved, there's a couple of years before it gets on the ground, right? So while we look at the existing job centers when we're bringing it forward for approval, I think on the back end, or the opportunity for us, is when we're recruiting jobs, we can say to the company or to the organization, we know that in a couple of years, there are going to be X number of households in this area that are earning whatever it is they're going to be earning. And so maybe that's simply one way or one opportunity that we can attack it going forward. And perhaps we can build some of that into our metric setting. I think the other thing that we can do is when we are attracting jobs, we can look at who are the current residents and what are the opportunities. I think someone said earlier, and I love that word, we can be intentional about guiding organizations there perhaps, and then really working with the residents, the existing residents, on opportunities for upskilling. So as Mr. Bakari said, we're just opening this conversation, but again, I'm excited. I think there are lots of opportunities for us to better align and be more intentional as we're building out this jobs plan and setting our metrics. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's well said, Ms. Weidman. And I think, again, if you're looking for a visual, each one of these conversations we've had spans a whole different division of city staff and a whole different topic. But if you're looking for a visual here, for me, it's quite simply, we've got probably over 20,000 units of affordable housing we still need to solve for, and it gets worse and worse each year. How do we, instead of creating 10 new units in this and 100 here that can serve 10 or 100 people, how do we multiply that by 5 or 7 or 8? Because the affordable housing becomes a transitionary period for them to stay as we have those seamless wraparound services around those that this can work for. And then we are able to free up that for a new set. It doesn't work in every case, but clearly if we tie these plans together, it can be more effective. And with that, Ms. Johnson, I think you have a question or a comment?
I do. Again, I love this comprehensive approach. I think about our committees and how siloed we are. But I think this is definitely a model that all of the committees could take a look at issues and then bring in the subject matter experts to look at the issue from a different lens. I wanted to ask Ms. Weidman, what is the average price of a 2-bedroom apartment here in Charlotte?
So Ms. Johnson, in terms of a market rate, apartment, yeah. I think that could range anywhere from, and please don't quote me on this. Okay. I think that it will depend on kind of where you are in Charlotte, which is where I think we could be kind of more surgical in this plan. I think it could range safely to say anywhere from, call it, $1,200 a month to maybe $1,800 a month. And again, that depends on where you are in the city.
And the reason I ask, because from a job perspective, if we want to be intentional, we need to look at that, do that math, whatever, 3 times that is to qualify for a 2-bedroom unit. And when recruiting employers, we need to have that number in mind, because how are we bridging the gap and moving upward mobility if we're not creating jobs to be able to afford to live in the city? So that's the kind of information that this comprehensive approach allows staff to take a look at. I think that's an important number. If there's incentives for employers who will pay the rate for individuals to be able to live here in Charlotte. So I appreciate your having that information. Thank you.
Yeah. This has been a great dialogue there. And Ms. Weidman, did you have anything else you were going to add just before I cut you off there?
Sure. I would just, Ms. Johnson, thank you so much for raising that. And one of the things I often point out is that, I'll use for an example, call centers, right? We recruit call centers, and call centers are definitely great jobs. We have one of our very own, our 311 call center. But often if you look at the salary in a call center, and again, it depends, but if you look at an average salary in a call center, that is often, that salary calls for an affordable rent. And so that, we just need to acknowledge that. And it speaks to the value of kind of what we do from a trust fund development. And I think it also speaks to an opportunity that we have as we continue to build out our housing efforts and really partner with recruiting jobs and the work of ED. So again, excited. Thank you. And I'll stop there.
Well, let me say, we know we can't build our way out of this crisis, and you do a phenomenal job. But I just did the math to qualify for an $1,800 a month unit. A person would have to make $64,800. So those are the kind of statistics that we want to keep in mind when recruiting jobs, what the cost of living here is in Charlotte. So
that is spot on. And I think that's a great note to end on right there, which is if we get this right, which it's going to be hard, and clearly this is our first meeting of bringing all of you other leaders in from different divisions to have this starting point conversation to kick it off. If we're successful and we have the strategic employment plan that intermixes and mingles with all these other comp plans and transit plans, all these things that we have, the outcome should be not how do we find, the jobs that pay the amount that people can get now, rather how do the $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 paying jobs a year, $130,000 paying jobs a year, don't become something we look at and say, that's not equitable. They become something we say, we have the training, the wraparound services, all the things in place, and we've tied the strings to say, you can hire locally here because the talent is being created and built and churned in, and then we achieve upward mobility in that way. I think it's a bold way that could fail 100 different times over, but if we get it right, we'll be a national model. And that's what I hope this cross-department dialogue can start to generate, those real thoughts of when $100,000 average company is jobs providing company comes to town and we announce it, no one shakes their head and says, oh, that's not getting to the people we needed to get to, because we know we laid the groundwork for that. So with that, Ms. Dodson and Fran, can you guys take us to what is clearly the next logical piece of this, which is what does the raw data tell us and what's there?
So, Councilman Bakari, before we do that, I want to back up there because there was one more bullet on that last slide about the corridors of opportunity. And I just want to kind of tie it all together and reiterate some of it. You all know how we've handled the corridors of opportunity, that we're looking at it in a very strategic way. We have a lot of cross collaboration between departments and initiatives in the corridors, from infrastructure to public-private partnerships on redevelopment, housing, placemaking, even mobility. And so what we're starting to do in our corridors, and you'll hear more about this from Amy, is be really strategic about what is the talent in the corridors, what is the need and the barriers in the corridors, and look for the opportunities for jobs to go into the corridors and eliminating the barriers. I'll give you one example that we are close, we think, on bringing some jobs in the West Boulevard vicinity, I'll call it. And we started conversations then. It's great to land a company in the West Boulevard vicinity, but then you have to go further and you have to start having conversations with, okay, how do we create pipeline out of that corridor? And so conversations that Fran and I have been having is like with Renaissance West. How can Renaissance West help create that pipeline for us for these jobs? And then are we going to look at other things, like are we going to have mobility issues to and from this job if it's not directly on the corridor or directly on the bus line? And then that leads to a conversation with John. And so it shows you how we are being cross-collaborative and strategic, but also a little bit creative in how we go about this to try to solve some of these. And that's really when I started to think about metrics, where and you can look back and you can look at places like in our corridors or vicinities of our corridors. So we brought X number of jobs there. We did infrastructure projects. We saw redevelopment there. We did affordable housing there. That's when you really start to see the impact. So I'll kick it back over to Fran, unless there's discussion on that part, just to talk about, you want to talk about what's next on the strategic employment?
Yeah, I can wrap it up really quickly, and then we're going to transition to Amy and John with EY. I think our next steps is we are continuing to work to bring something back in April for budget and for your viewing to better understand exactly how we would get this done and how we would fund it. And so there's a lot of activity on our end over the next month or month and a half. And so this will come back before you all much more in depth, I guess, not necessarily in depth, but more process oriented in April. So thank you so much for your time today, and want to transition ahead to Ernst & Young. So if that's okay with you, Councilmember Bakari, we're going to move on.
It sounds great. Let's do that. The only thing I would say is let's remember, and I know you guys do, so it's not like it's anything you don't know. Let's remember the urgency that we need to act with is real, because this isn't just a nice to have plan. This is also part and parcel with our city's, restoration and recovery from COVID. And I believe this will be the glue that binds that. So while there's be some slower moving parts, Fran Pilot West, as the former chair would say and call you, we need to find short-term ways to make impacts to re-jumpstart the economy.
Agreed. Well, thank you very much. So today I'm really excited to introduce to you all Amy Holloway with Ernst & Young and John Rees. They have been leading the study I've told you about multiple times that Ernst & Young is doing, Councilmember Johnson, and follow up to all of the conversation we had last September around unemployment in our corridors and the mayor's referral to look at unemployment in these areas. Amy and her team have really been taking a data-driven approach. One of the first questions we asked and talked about is who is unemployed? Let's not make assumptions. Let's learn from the data. And so I'm excited to have a quick update for you guys today, but more importantly, some conversation. So hopefully we can add some color to the data that we have. So Amy, I will transition it over to you.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. It is good to be with you virtually, and I think this is a great time for us to give you a quick update on our process and share with you some of the aha moments that have come out of our research. This is an important part of your strategic employment plan, and we're working on it in parallel with the strategic employment plan, hoping to complete our work later this month or even in early April so that you have the results of our work while you're putting the final touches on the plan itself. This is just an overview of our scope. We were given the assignment of looking at the corridors of opportunity through a data-driven perspective. I think it's really important. Progress on economic equity and economic recovery always begins with a deep dive into data, and that's what we're delivering to you. The first thing that we did was actually define those corridor geographies, actually map them out block by block to determine what areas we're looking at in town. And then we conducted a workforce analysis for each corridor. It sounds like you guys have seen some of our preliminary data, but again, we'll just share a few highlights with you here in a minute. And we're also looking at two other things related to those corridors. Industry clusters, so what types of businesses are located there and really what types of industries are really strong for your region, as well as current real estate use along those corridors. And the end result is going to be a series of recommendations for you that can bubble up into the strategic employment plan, and it will help inform city decisions around your economic development initiative and other initiatives as well. So what industries and what types of businesses are great fits for those corridors that would provide the people who are living in those corridors who are unemployed or underemployed great career pathway opportunities going forward? What types of workforce development initiatives are needed along those corridors, as well as what type of human services might be needed there within the corridors to help people overcome their barriers to employment? It'll also help inform what types of businesses you engage, whether that's through recruiting from outside of the region or partnering with existing businesses within Charlotte to have a presence in those corridors. And then finally, a whole host of other city-related investments and public-private partnership opportunities. I think this is super exciting. Before I hand it over to John to share with you some results, we're doing work like this all over the country and being asked to really think about our economic development planning through an economic equity lens and through an economic recovery lens. And I have to give you guys kudos. This is a super bold initiative. You're doing it in a very, I think, really concentrated way to get you the data and the recommendations you need to take a giant leap forward. And I think you can be a model for other communities across the country who haven't seen any communities right now that are quite as far along as you guys are. So kudos to you. And I'm going to hand it over to John to just give you a snapshot of the data. I want to respect your time, and I also want to make sure we have some time for asking you guys some questions. So John.
Next slide, please. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Rees, Director of Research here at the UI Economic Development Advisory Service practice. I'm going to keep it really brief. I think Councilmember Bakari said an appetizer. This might just be an amuse-bouche of data. There is a host, wealth of additional information in the final deliverable that we'll be providing you. But I just, again, want to provide a very high-level sort of overview of some of those aha moments that Amy spoke about earlier. Our work focused on 3 corridor areas, sort of the Sugar Creek corridor to the right, Betty's Ford, and the sort of central area and the Freedom, Wilkinson, and West corridor. The highlighted areas represent, as Amy said, sort of that block by block analysis of U.S. Census data, looking at sort of the demographic profile of whether people have jobs or whether they don't have jobs. Took a slightly bigger approach when it came to an analysis of the employment data. So that's typically at the zip code level. And by integrating that, we get a really nice portrait of the employment dynamics within the community, what talent is available, and what populations there might need to be sort of a policy intervention to increase their opportunities to get a job and to sort of get on that track for greater employment opportunities moving forward. Next slide, please.
And John, also, we didn't just base this analysis on the data that were provided and available through government sources, but we've also done some resident surveys, employer surveys, and a lot of great conversations. So it's this quantitative and qualitative approach to our analysis. Just wanted to put that in there.
Absolutely. To me, I think one of the big high-level takeaways is, over the last 5 or 10 years, the Charlotte region has actually performed quite well economically. You actually do see that in the corridors, right? Levels of poverty have declined, opportunities have increased, but they've been relatively modest given sort of the overall pace of how dynamically the city of Charlotte has performed over the last 5 to 10 years. And again, I think Councilmember Bakari alluded to this earlier. One of our immediate concerns is some of that progress may be derailed with the pandemic and the outbreak. When you look at the employment profile of people living in these corridors, they tend to be some of those frontline workers that have been directly either threatened from a health perspective or from employment disruption perspective. And so how do we make sure moving forward that all that progress doesn't unravel due to the pandemic? When it actually comes to sort of who is unemployed, the most striking element, I believe, in all of the corridors is how much of it is among younger individuals, right? When you look at that 16 to 24-year-old population, in some of the corridors, you've got about 1 in 3 individuals in those age brackets unemployed. How do we make sure they have the skills? A lot of them are high school dropouts. How do we get them back to be certified? Because even in the corridors, higher levels of education are directly correlated with much better employment outcomes. When you look at anything from poverty to median household income to a host of other sort of outcomes, generally speaking, education matters. With that said, even that's sort of not enough. We also need to think of a lot of stuff that everybody else has been talking about, whether it's housing opportunities, making sure the real estate is available to absorb those operations that would provide high income, high skill employment opportunities, to even things like transit. One thing that did come out of our work is there is a disproportionately high reliance on public transit. I want to say sort of citywide, it's about 3% of people are using public transit. Within these corridors, it's anywhere from 5 to about 10%. So it's vital that there's an efficient transportation system that can connect those individuals to employment opportunities that arise. Next slide. Again, I can't remember who spoke to it earlier, is that, these populations do have areas of specialization, right? If you look in the Betty's Ford corridor, people living there tend to be disproportionately employed in transportation and healthcare support. Within the Wilkins Boulevard corridor, it's transportation and material moving, which perhaps isn't that surprising given all the logistics and distribution activity occurring adjacent to the airport. On Sugar Creek, it's material moving, which again largely supports transportation and logistics companies, as well as production, which speaks to some opportunities maybe to support additional manufacturing operations within the short Sugar Creek corridor. But again, each of these areas has or segments of talent strengths that can be leveraged to help recruit companies and to support, again, greater employment opportunities. And finally, I'll just say, right now, there is relatively little alignment between the people who live in these corridors and the job opportunities directly there, which again is one of the reasons something like transit is so important, because that's often the link that connects an individual to an employment opportunity, regardless of where it may be in the city. But again, moving forward, how do we better align employment opportunities so that people aren't necessarily, having to go to another part of Charlotte to find opportunity, that there is plenty of opportunity within their sort of backyard. Again, that is the very high level data takeaways. If for any data nerds out there, there is so much more sort of in this report for further reading.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd chime in here, and the data will be the difference between success and failure in this mission for us. There are some things that pop out at me that lead me to think, wow, here's a hypothesis, right? Which is, all right, transportation, healthcare support. There are skill sets there in Beatties Ford Corridor. And then you look at the next slide, your corridor demographics you didn't cover. We would have assumed that in these corridors there would have been a higher percentage of people of color, but I necessarily wouldn't have assumed that there would be a much higher percentage of younger people at the 25-year mark. And that tells me there's a different recipe by which you upskill and uptrain for capabilities you might bring than if it was a slightly older demographic than the average of Charlotte. So I think in this data is a lot of power for us to start really kind of taking ownership at a micro level and a scalpel out, as I said before, and saying, hey, we can go and recruit the best health tech ancillary companies that float around Atrium and Novant, put them inside an area of which we've got upskilling, and then it's just about making sure that transportation and all the other points you said aren't hindrances that prevent them from being able to attack the upskilling necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this data gives you this opportunity to have a hyper-targeted approach, almost, I keep saying block by block, but you can see the skill sets of the individuals living there. You can see their barriers to employment, and now we can do something about it. Now we can determine what types of employers should be there, what types of jobs will give them the longest term career pathways if coupled with training and workforce development initiatives.
Councilwoman Watlington, I think you have a question.
I just want to, first of all, make sure that I'm understanding when you say here that each corridor has areas of specialty, is that reflective of the businesses along the corridor or reflective of the people's skill?
It's actually the people's skill. I think that's one of the compelling aspects of our analysis, and something that often gets missed is that someone will look at sort of an area and say, here's what's going on, and they're talking about the businesses, but that may not be representative of the skills actually possessed by the individuals living in this community. So when I talked about sort of healthcare support or transportation logistics or manufacturing skills, those are among the individuals residing within those corridors.
Okay. One thing I want to point out is what I don't want to do is reinforce what's already been in the corridors, given that we've highlighted corridors as corridors of opportunity for a reason. So I think this is great work, and I would be interested to see the details of the data. I just want us to think about the future state versus only current state. I'm not saying that's what folks are going to purporting right now, but I just want to caution us that we think about what could be versus what is, because we see that given the skills that people currently have, whether it's transportation and healthcare support or transportation and material moving or production and material moving, those skills have led them to roles in which we're struggling with affordable housing and nature. So I just want us to, if we could include in our analysis what could be potential good fits for people to move to the next level socioeconomically, rather than using this data to perpetuate some of the types of jobs that are already existing. I think about healthcare support. What does that mean? We got a lot of CNAs along Beatties Ford Corridor, and if so, I'm sure there are opportunities to upskill specifically in that component rather than providing additional CNA jobs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you are spot on there. And I might say to Tracy and Fran, as we are trying to tease out angles to explore for ultimately our policy that drives all this, I think that's the key, right? Which is we're not looking to like add more of the kind of remedial or more remedial jobs just because we think that's what the data says is allowable there. What we want to say is what is the upward mobility trajectory that this aptitude is the starting point to transfer from a job to a career, right? And that career has a high ceiling. And I think I don't believe I've ever come across something at the bottom of that spectrum that didn't tie in some way, even if it was a little bit hazy, to an ultimate higher end career that can go there. I think it's just up to us to make sure we don't perpetuate those points. I think that's an excellent policy point that's been made.
If I could follow up to that real
Yes,
quick, Mr.
please.
Chair. I just wanted to say to the other side of that coin, and I may have missed it, so forgive me. So like I said, I'd love to see a little bit more about the data if it's available. Do we have a sense of what those businesses are? I think about Wilkinson and West Boulevard that head straight to the airport, right? There are so many types of jobs at the airport. Are there any that lend themselves to a good pipeline for some of these, like production and material moving, for instance? The other piece, and I know it's not here, but I think it's the game changer, really, right? In terms of how do you get people actually hired into some of these roles? We know that it's not always a skill thing. It may be a background issue that creates barriers to employment. Where does that fall in this strategy that we're starting to think about? Because outside of construction services, I'm not hearing a lot of talk about how we deal with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think I can respond to this.
Yeah, I think overall,
Oh, go ahead.
what concerns us initially will be at least sort of a parallel track, right? That for some of the people already, let's say in sort of healthcare, how do we upskill them to get them an even better job within that industry? How do we make sure the corridors are positioned to take advantage of trends going on with that? And then there is this other aspect of it is how do we just get people engaged to get on that sort of first rung, to anchor them within the labor force initially, and sort of then, they will also be upskilled. So I think there is sort of a multiple parallel track to engaging opportunities and promoting opportunities throughout sort of the life cycle of residents within the corridors.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, when I think about I love the fact that everybody is here today because there's so many different components, right? What I'd like to even see us broaden our work team further to even include the county. And the reason I say that is because this is a very individual type of approach, right? We say the corridors, but we're really talking about the people in the corridors, and each one of them has a unique situation or circumstance that may need a nuanced approach. I think about some of the folks who want to upskill at work during the day, and I know that Goodwill does classes in the evenings now and some kind of modified schedules so that people can truly still work and upskill at the same time. Those are some of the things that as you get into the weeds, if you will, I think we're going to really need to have that conversation with the county to enroll them in some of the wraparound services to really get people out of the situations they're in, because sometimes it's about awareness and access. But other times, people are quite aware of where they're trying to go, but the barriers that exist, they aren't able to navigate those things by themselves. So that's my only other piece. Thank you.
Yeah, no, well said, and I agree fully there. Councilwoman Johnson, did you have a question or comment?
I do, thank you. We also had a report, and I believe it was from Charlotte Works, that spoke to the barriers in employment, such as the disability and criminal justice involved. I think that's really important while we're looking at this data, to also look at the barriers of why people aren't working, so that we're able to look at solving that problem as well. And I know we've seen it, we get so much information, but if that could be combined into the information that we get from Tracy's team, then we can really look at resolving this on a systemic level.
Agreed. Very much so.
We do provide some of that data on, people with disabilities, people.
English is a second language. If there's a language barrier that prevents them from finding a career, there's information there about what we call disconnected youth, which is youth that not only are not employed, but they aren't attending any schooling. I know there's another one that I'm blanking on now. Proximity to childcare, which is sort of a difficult one because that doesn't seem to generally be a problem, but often it's not really the physical proximity, it's the pricing of childcare that's a barrier. So we are definitely looking at other issues that might impede someone's ability to participate, whether or not it's in an educational opportunity or the workforce in general.
If I could jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Engel, also with EY. We are surveying residents and pulling some of that data, asking what barriers exist for individuals to find employment. Why are they unemployed? What sort of services do they need? So that information is being processed, and we'll include it in the report.
Yeah. And I think that the broader point for Tracy, you guys to take away there is we're not gonna know what level of data is going to be relevant to us as we start getting down this rabbit hole. So making sure that we collect it all, and even with cross departments and things like that, we keep it associated, we keep it tagged so that when we get to a point that we're not quite understanding why the outcome isn't occurring the way we wanted it to, perhaps the data tells us that. So perhaps a deep conversation with Renee, our CIO over there, could help us understand how we create this multifaceted database that we're going to need. So that's great. And then Councilwoman Ajmera, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So E&Y, great job on this deeper dive on the data, which really helps us tackle the employment gaps and figure out our implementation plan. So I noticed in your previous slide where you had opportunity corridors, I'm trying to understand what areas of specialty you were able to find with Eastland Corridor, Central and Albemarle Corridor.
Councilmember Ajmera, this is Tracy. They were, for the deeper dive work, EY was only looking at Beatties Ford Corridor, Wilkinson, Sugar Creek to west. We still have other corridors on the deeper dive. We've done a very high level research on all the corridors, but we haven't done the deep dive on Central and Albemarle. That'll, like I said, that will be next.
Okay, yes, I would be interested in really looking at a comprehensive data set for all the corridors so that we can develop an implementation plan. I know one of the data set that John had mentioned was barriers such as ESL or disability, daycare, and so on. As a group, last year we had met, including Fran and Chairman and others, we had met with the various groups to address some of these employment barriers when it comes to immigrant and refugee community for Albemarle and Central Corridor. And some of those recommendations came from Federico and his team as we move forward with our meetings. And I would like to see how those recommendations that's been provided by these organizations who work at the grassroots level and how that fit into our overall implementation plan, because we're trying to take this micro approach to address employment gaps specific to corridor, and each corridor is going to have a very unique plan based on the barriers that Councilmember Johnson mentioned, based on the specialty and based on really the skills. So I'm really, I'll be setting up a meeting, follow-up meeting. I know it would be a first time where Councilmember Bukhari will be meeting with some of these groups, but the recommendations that have been provided by Federico and his team would be crucial in tackling employment, especially for Albemarle and Central Corridor. Also, I like how we are looking at this from comprehensive perspective, where we are looking at it from housing, jobs, and transportation. I can tell you some of the things we hear, it's really around transportation, where people have to get to work from point A to point B, and the public transportation is really a barrier. And that was one of the pain points that we had that had come up in our conversation with immigrant and refugee community. So as we are developing this comprehensive approach, it is crucial that our implementation plan also includes our transportation initiatives, so that yes, we can have jobs and we can have the skill set, but if people cannot get to work, then we're not going to be successful. So really where rubber meets the road, it's the implementation of all of these data points and all of this connecting dots. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Phipps.
Yeah, one thing I take from this slide is I like the part when they say that, corridor residents work in every part of Charlotte. So even though we're focused on the corridors, we recognize that they have to leave the corridors on a lot of occasions to get to some of these jobs. But one of the things that I want to know is, in your work, are we looking at, because I know that the city has been losing a lot of light industrial space. It's been moving out, near the airport and such. Do we know if we have any land capacity within the corridors for a light manufacturing facility, or do we have any room to repurpose some of these existing businesses to do some of this work? How much of that are we focusing on in the individual corridors to bring some of those kinds of logistics, transportation, moving jobs right in the corridor itself?
So, Councilmember Phipps, I'm glad you asked that question. It's a multi-pronged answer. One, EY, in their deeper dive on the Beatties Ford Wilkinson, Freedom, and Sugar Creek corridors, they are looking at real estate, what's for sale, what's for lease, what exists out there, so that it's easy to say, why don't we put more jobs there? But we really need to inventory what we have and what opportunities we have. But in addition to that, Fran and I have had a lot of conversations with the planning team, especially as we talk about the UDO and place types. What is the future? I don't like the word industrial, because it seems like from a zoning type, it just seems to indicate smokestacks and heavy industrial. And really what we're talking about now is something that could live in close proximity to our corridors. And we are taking an assessment of that land. We're also having conversations about where do those opportunities not exist that they perhaps should exist. It might not always be right on a corridor, but it's in close proximity to the corridor. Where are those opportunities? You mentioned the airport. How much more do we have out at the airport? And we've had conversations even with the airport as recent as last week about, let's make sure that the land that's out there for redevelopment for jobs aligns with the types of jobs that we're trying to pull to our corridors. And so those are conversations that are happening right now on a bunch of different areas as it relates to industrial, and then really what is the future of kind of that industrial land use in the way that we want to see it in our city.
It's a great question. We're almost out of time. Did John Lewis want to follow up really quick on something?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on Councilwoman Ajmira's comment, and I think she's spot on this issue that many times transportation, particularly public transportation, becomes a barrier, not because access isn't necessarily there. There are bus routes and opportunities throughout the region, but many times they're not frequent enough. And we have so many, more than half of our routes are on headways, that's frequencies between buses of 45 minutes or greater. And so imagine if you're trying to get to work and you miss a bus and you have to stand there for 45 minutes or an hour before the next bus comes, even though there's a route there and technically there's access. But if we can't get frequencies down below 30 in that 15-minute range, then it becomes an unintentional barrier to everything we're trying to accomplish in this. So it's not just where the routes are located, but they have to be frequent and reliable. And I absolutely would like, if we take nothing else from this, that frequent, reliable service is really an undergirder of everything we're trying to do from a mobility standpoint.
Great point. And I think this, to me, like I've got a buzz of excitement about me with this, because I feel like we don't often get to have these kind of conversations across verticals where we just see how relevant a certain slice of Pam or John or whoever's topic is when we talk about economic development, workforce, jobs, business. So I think this has been incredibly powerful, and it's just the starting point of where we're going to be able to go from here. And again, I think what Councilman Phipps just said is also critical. And you think about, we have area plans and we have comp plans and all these things, but they're loosely connected to jobs, to industry, and nothing more so than the industrial business kind of conundrum we've been facing for the last couple of years. That's articulated perfectly in that, where we should have a strategic employment plan that we all agree and that we've adopted throughout all of council that is a big factor, not just a kind of a secondary talking point that we need to get behind. So with that, we're going over. I have my last segment, and then I'm going to hand it to staff to close out. This is one where we're trying out. We're going to try to figure out what we should do going forward and how to maximize this. But in this little chairman's report, essentially what I want it to be is an output when we get enough critical mass or enough excitement behind an idea that's on one of your checklists as individual council members. When we meet one-on-one, we just take 30 seconds, highlight it, and hand it over to staff for any comments, and then to go and see if there's some angle by which they could utilize it. And this one, actually, several folks said it, but none more so than Renee, where in highlighting the food deserts. And again, it ties in perfectly to everything we've just said right now. If you don't have the proper wraparound services, particularly access to food in your neighborhood, in your areas where you're dealing with 100 other things while trying to upskill, while trying to develop a next step in your career, that's a challenge, and it's a distraction, and it's one that can sidetrack you on a journey to upward mobility. So thinking about it outside of the box, one of the first things after Councilman Eggleston actually pulled me in a meeting with a grocer who was talking about this and their internal process and how they want to expand, but based on their own internal conversations inside their own corporate areas, they have these challenges of showing the numbers and saying this can work in this part of town or not. So that's when we started down the path of talking to staff and saying, well, could we use BIGs, business investment grants, and actually use those for food deserts? And that evolved to, can we use TIGs in this way? Tax increment grants, where ultimately that could be the difference in justifying where the puck is today versus where it's going to be in a neighborhood, in a corridor of opportunity, so that they are able to bypass some of those hurdles, put a grocery store that's needed in that area, and be where the puck is going to be as that area grows. We've gotten great feedback from the private sector and the folks that said, I might be able to sell that internally and get these opportunities with that one tool. So it's about thinking about our tools differently. Before I let staff close it out, Renee, would you like to add any kind of points, since you're one of the key folks that brought that up? And I think it's a great challenge, and hopefully one we can solve for.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the lead with that, or taking the ball and running with that. And that's another area where everything we do kind of overlaps. This is what brought this to our attention. Yes, we've talked about the food desert at Sugar Creek and Hidden Valley, but there's a current development. And the neighbors are opposed, but it's not just for that reason. It's the infrastructure. It's the food desert. It's the schools. It's all of that. And those are the things that we say, some of that's not council responsibility. But if we look at the issues from a person-centered and just address as many issues as we can, I think it's wonderful. I hope that we can be intentional and be tactical and be strategic in looking at these areas and solving these problems from a policy perspective. So thank you for that. I'm excited to see the grocery store in Hidden Valley. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And that would hopefully just be, if we can figure that model out and it solves for their internal decision-making process with corporate, just the beginning of us solving food deserts with another tool that we already have that we use in other ways. So any final thoughts on that one, Tracy, and then final thoughts overall?
No, I think that Councilman Bukhari, on that particular item, we've started having some discussions to understand what our TIG legislation is and what we can and can't do with it. I think then from there it would be worth expanding to have the conversations with grocers, thinking about and understanding some of what we're getting back from the EY team related to real estate opportunities in corridors, and just try to almost do a test case to see, do we have instances where things line up for success related to that particular topic. The last thing I wanted to circle back around on, when we started, is we kind of hit the ground running at the beginning of the meeting, but really draw attention to Christina Thigpen, who joined us exactly a month ago as our Deputy Director in Economic Development. And so I just wanted to make sure that especially this group of council members had the opportunity to know that she's recently joined us. Christina, do you want to give them just a quick little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So I'm really excited to work.
Unmute.
It's so great to be working with you all. I come most recently from Northwood office and really was involved with the Ballantyne Reimagined rezoning approval process, and always, thought about public service, and that just heightened my interest. Before that, I was with the Bissell Companies in a similar capacity, so a lot of my background is marketing and communications, and recognize that this is such a pivotal time to be a part of all the incredible work that Tracy's team's doing and to map out, Charlotte's success for tomorrow. So look forward to working with you all on all these exciting initiatives.
Excellent. Welcome to the team.
Thank you.
So with that, Mr. Vice Chair, any final closing thoughts from you?
No, congratulations on your first meeting.
I made it through.
You made it through, and I'm very excited about what we're about to do. It's a lot of work, a lot of details, but it makes a lot of sense. So I look forward to working with you guys.
Excellent. And with that, I think that's the crux here is we just had a real robust policy discussion outside of our vertical with a lot of partners. We've laid out a lot of ideas for policy, things that can shape. What we can't allow is for a month to pass and we have the same conversation. This needs to be the starting gun that just went off, and all the work to explore ideas that were created here start moving forward, and it becomes an update of progress and another round of policy debate the next time we get together. That's how we'll know we're succeeding. Any final words there, Tracy or Fran?
Yeah. I think you closed this out well. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for the work. Thank you all for everything you do, and let's keep it moving forward.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.